Like any long-running shonen, Fairy Tail has its own set of forbidden, ancient, and even very treasured magical abilities and attacks that others could use, or last resorts needed for some big grand attack. And none are exemplified more than the 3 great fairy spells. These are Fairy Tail's 3 most powerful spells that have been passed down from Guildmaster to Guildmaster, and have essentially been an ace in the hole for Fairy Tail whenever it has been needed, with one of them being used more often throughout the entirety of the series and is more synonymous with the 3 great fairy spells, as when you think about it, you think to one particular spell more likely than others. Now you can make an argument that it is actually 4 great fairy spells if you include Fairy Heart. However, it is something entirely different from the 3 great fairy spells, and that is a video in and of itself. But today I'm going to be explaining to you guys all 3 of the great fairy spells in detail. But before we get into all that, don't forget to like and subscribe and hit the notification bell for updates on future videos. Really helps and ensures you guys enjoy the content I make here on the channel and you want to see more. I want to explain more aspects of Fairy Tail, whether it be particular magics, characters, guilds, or certain aspects of the series that might need a bit more explaining, as I am going back through Fairy Tail on my spare time, and I feel like some things do need a bit more explaining for those that haven't watched it in a long time, or those that don't have a good bearings on some of the powers and abilities and places of Fairy Tail. But if you like me talking about the great fairy spells and you want me to talk about Fairy Heart sooner, get this video to 5k views by the next Fairy Tail Fridays video. And that'll show me that you guys want to see more videos like this. But for now, let's get right into this video. So the first great fairy spell that we're going to talk about is obviously the one that you think about the most when this topic comes to mind, and that is Fairy Law. Arguably, probably the strongest and mostly overpowered ability when it comes to the great fairy spells, as this is an incredibly powerful and even last resort type ability that, as of right now, only a select few people have learned this spell. In order of people who have learned it, the first Master of Fairy Tail, Mavis; the second Master of Fairy Tail, Prect, who is currently Hades; the third Master, Makarov; and his grandson, Loxus. These 4 people have all learned how to use Fairy Law, and Fairy Law has been used a roughly 6 amount of times throughout the Fairy Tail story. Now, I said Fairy Law a couple times, so what exactly does it do? Well, Fairy Law, it's actually a fairly simple spell when it comes to its description, despite it being incredibly powerful. Now, in truth, the origin of Fairy Law is that it is actually an improved upon and updated version of the spell Law that Mavis learned when Zeref taught her how to access her magic and improve upon it, as it was a spell that she needed to help save her friend and use in a last-ditch effort. However, due to a side effect of using the spell, Mavis was no longer able to age and maintained 15 years old to her dying days. So she updated the spell so that the user does not end up suffering the exact same side effects. Now, how Fairy Law particularly works is pretty simple, like I said. When the caster of the spell activates it, it engulfs the area in a large bright ray of light, only targeting those that the caster deems as an enemy, leaving friends and bystanders unharmed. Now, while that is fairly simple on paper, the more complex thing is that whoever is friend or foe is deemed not by the person's mental state, but deep in their hearts. You cannot lie to Fairy Law. It judges based off of your own internal logic and your soul and what you believe to be your friends and family, even in your subconscious. This was proven when Loxus attempted to use Fairy Law in his fight against Natsu and Gajeel to wipe out everybody who he deemed to be a weakling and an enemy in the Fairy Tail Festival arc. But once the spell was cast, nobody was harmed, as it was revealed that deep down in his heart, Loxus did not hate anyone in Fairy Tail. He held no animosity. He cared for them as his own family, but he essentially was lying to himself. He gaslit himself into thinking that he was doing it for the guild, that everybody was his enemy because he wanted everything to be stronger. He believed in himself too much, and it warped his perception of things. However, deep in his heart, he still found his friends to be his friends and not his enemies, so Fairy Law did not activate. In juxtaposition, the first instance of Fairy Law we see is when Makarov uses against the Phantom Lord Guildmaster, Jose. And also, very amazing entrance for Makarov when he ends up using Fairy Law, and the sound effects in the anime are very well done. It gives a sense of grandiosness and divinity when it's used. Now, one important thing about Fairy Law, and this was stated by Prect, the second master, when he confronted Makarov at Tenro Island, is that Fairy Law is more so a deterrent magic. it is meant to discourage any further action against the guild and its members from its enemies, in that it shouldn't be used lightly. And the reason is, more so than not, that Fairy Law does shave off a bit off your lifespan the more you use it. Primarily with the single warning that it should only be used against a singular target. The more targets the caster uses Fairy Law on, the more lethal it'll be to their lifespan, and worst case scenario, it can lead to death. Like in the final instance of Fairy Law in the main series, when Makarov used it against the Alvarez army to try and save as many members of Fairy Tail as he possibly could. Now, since Makarov didn't die, he probably just had barely enough life force to stay alive. I'm just going to write that off to plot armor. But either way, Fairy Law is an incredibly powerful spell that, when used correctly, can take out a powerful enemy in one hit, or wipe out a good chunk of an army in exchange for a vast amount of your lifespan. Now, one quick thing is that this has only been done once, but on Tenro Island, it is actually possible for two casters of Fairy Law to essentially cancel each other out. This will show when Makarov faced off against Hades, who is revealed to be the second Master Prect, as they both use Fairy Law at the exact same time. But yeah, that's all the general information you need about Fairy Law. A very powerful spell with some pretty drastic drawbacks if used too often or against multiple targets. Now then, in order of introduction, let's go with the second great fairy spell, and it is actually another attack-based spell, and that is Fairy Glitter. Now this spell has actually been used more times, but by less people, its primary user being Kana, and also Mavis, as she is essentially the one that had created it, and later on by August, as he eventually learned to copy Fairy Glitter. Now, unlike Fairy Law, where it was essentially taught by Guildmaster to Guildmaster as presumed through the story, Fairy Glitter was actually sealed in Mavis's grave on Tenro Island. Whoever found it at the grave would essentially know how to use Fairy Glitter, and it is essentially supposed to be a spell that rivals Fairy Law in terms of power. However, unlike Fairy Law, it is a lot more intricate in its usage, as it collects the light of the sun and moon and the stars and collects it and concentrates it for its blast. It is an incantation type magic, and according to Mavis, it takes a lot of magic power and concentration to use it properly. Kana attempted to use it directly after finding the incantation to use Fairy Glitter on Tenro Island against Blue Note, but it didn't work as it was her first time using it, even though she had a considerable amount of power. But Kana later revealed that she mastered it over the course of a couple of months during the Grand Magic Games. And the debut was essentially on a magic identifying machine to measure power, and it destroyed the machine and surpassed the score of a Wizard Saint, who is Wizard Saint Jura, one of Fiore's strongest wizards. Now, I should have mentioned this earlier, but here is the incantation in order to utilize Fairy Glitter. Gather a river of light that's guided by the fairies. Shine in order to perish the fangs of evil. Fairy Glitter. Pretty short incantation, but the fact that you need to actually use it as an incantation to use a spell is a bit of a detriment, as it is time consuming. Then again, many spells are. Now, as of right now, it does not seem like Fairy Glitter has any real drawbacks after usage, as Kana has used it multiple times in fights, primarily in her fight against August in the final arc when she was tag teaming him with Gildarts. Only real detriment is the same as any other magic spell, and that is the usage of her magical power. But Kana has enough of it and has practiced with Fairy Glitter enough to use it a multitude of times without too much drawbacks. Another thing that makes Fairy Glitter incredibly powerful is that it was actually able to injure Mavis's ethereal body. Now, in Fairy Tail, Mavis was never really dead. She was in a state of near death and stuck in a lacrima, but her soul was able to walk around and interact with the members of Fairy Tail and even speak to them. But it was essentially unable to be touched or seen by others. However, with the power of Fairy Glitter utilizing all of the magical energy as well as the sun, star, and moonlight, Kana was able to not only injure Mavis's ethereal body, which should not even technically be possible, but was also able to break the lacrima, sealing her body away in the first place and keeping her in that state of suspended animation. Meaning that it is very likely that Fairy Glitter can essentially injure ethereal beings, if one can be recognized and targeted, that is. But still, that is an insane feat, meaning that Kana could essentially use Fairy Glitter to fight people without a physical body if she can recognize them, or any user of Fairy Glitter. Now, there's also the possibility that Fairy Law could do the same thing, but we just aren't sure as it's never been used in that matter. But yeah, that's really all we know about Fairy Glitter. It's been used a lot more, but it's fairly simple to understand. It doesn't seem to have the drawbacks of Fairy Law. And like Fairy Law, seemingly if you are given the incantation and learn it, anyone can utilize it. They just need to master it over time and have a good amount of magical power in order to actually use Fairy Glitter. Also, something I forgot to mention earlier, back when I was talking about destroying the Lacrima encasing Mavis, it is actually Fairy Heart, and Fairy Heart has a ton of magical power and a lot of magical energy and all that, deemed to potentially be a very powerful magical weapon that has been used by Makara to keep Alvarez from advancing on them, and the fact that Fairy Glitter could destroy Lacrima, which was absorbing a ton of different magical powers, puts it on a different level of magic energy, where it can destroy Lacrima that has absorbed multiple spells and has a ton of magical power used to kind of seal away Mavis in the Fairy Heart spell in general. So that kind of bumps it up in terms of effectiveness, in my opinion. Anyway, that's two of the great fairy spells. Both of them are relatively offensive, with Fairy Law being more of a deterrent and Fairy Glitter being more offensive. But the third and final great fairy spell, and it was introduced alongside Fairy Glitter in the Tenro Island arc, and has only been used twice in Fairy Tail, is the defensive spell Fairy Sphere. With only two people casting the spell, Mavis Vermilion, the first master of Fairy Tail, and Lucy Heartfilia, which was at the very end of Fairy Tail. Now, unlike Fairy Law and Fairy Glitter, this is the easiest to understand and seemingly the easiest to use. Now, Fairy Sphere, in essence, basically converts Fairy Tail members' bonds and faith into magic power, and it takes the form of a giant sphere with the Fairy Tail emblem on it, as well as a pair of wings around the symbol. Now, Fairy Sphere is essentially the ultimate defensive magic. That is how it's been categorized, and as of this moment has never been destroyed or broken. And the sphere protects Fairy Tail members from great power and destruction, as well as great evil, and is even strong enough to evade time. When Fairy Sphere is casted, essentially it keeps everyone and everything inside in stasis, keeping them frozen in time for an undisclosed amount of days, minutes, weeks, even years. We saw this at the end of Tenro Island, when all the Fairy Tail members were holding hands and pouring their magic power into themselves to try and create a barrier. Mavis' soul was there on the island, witnessing everything, and so she used that to cast Fairy Sphere to protect everyone from Agnologia's breath. Now, this shows how strong Fairy Sphere is, as Agnologia is the strongest being in Fairy Tail outside of Zeref, and later on in 100 Years Quest, the 5 Dragon Guns, but we'll get there in another video. And Agnologia's powers are incredibly devastating. He could have wiped out Tenro Island with a single blast, with Fairy Sphere not only managed to protect everyone on the island and the island itself from the blast, but it was encased underneath the water for 7 years. Now, Fairy Sphere doesn't keep things locked in for 7 years in terms of a rule. The amount of time Fairy Sphere is active primarily depends on the amount of magical power that is poured into Fairy Sphere, meaning that all the members of Fairy Tail that were on Tenro Island had enough magical power plus whatever Mavis had and the magical power of Tenro Island to keep them sealed away in stasis, frozen in time, unable to age, and just stuck in cryosleep for 7 years. And it is speculated that if more and more people were to pour their magic power into the caster of Fairy Sphere, then the length of the sealing within Fairy Sphere could be exponentially longer, as by the end of Fairy Tail, thanks to Meredy giving a bond link to multiple people around Fiore and having everyone pour their magic power into Lucy so she can cast Fairy Sphere on Agnologia, it was very likely that Agnologia could have been sealed for many, many years, perhaps centuries or even millennia. We just don't know, but it's magic power of every wizard and every person on Fiore, and 7 years was just from the handful of members we had on Tenro Island. Imagine an entire continent of wizards, many of them being incredibly powerful. The possibilities and potential for that being a very powerful sealing magic as well as a protection magic is endless, and is most definitely worthy of the name of the ultimate defensive spell. And it does balance out the other two Great Fairy spells in terms of its durability and its usefulness, as the other two are more offensive while this one is purely defensive. Now, multiple people can actually use Fairy Sphere. While it has only been used by Mavis and later on Lucy, Mavis did leave instructions on how first people can actually use Fairy Sphere, but it requires the unison of magic from multiple Fairy Tail members upon the caster in order for it to be cast. So, while it is possible for a singular wizard to use Fairy Sphere, it would only last for a very, very short amount of time, primarily based on their magic power. And so that is why multiple members are needed in order for Fairy Sphere to be used more properly and to be a lot more powerful. Now, based off the end of Fairy Tail, this doesn't need Fairy Tail members in order to be utilized to have their powers put into it. So there really isn't any strict limitations or rules into using a Fairy Sphere. It just depends on the caster, as well as the amount of magical power needed for however strong you need the sphere to be. There's always the possibility that the caster has to be a Fairy Tail member, but that's never stated in the manga or in any of the Q&As that I could find. So it's very likely that just anybody can use Fairy Sphere, as long as they have the instructions in order to use it, as well as enough magical power to actually cast it, no matter how big it is. But yeah, those were 3 great fairy spells explained. I hope I helped you guys better understand these abilities as well as I possibly could. These 3 spells are synonymous with Fairy Tail, and I legitimately loved that they were introduced into the story. As early on as Phantom Lord, when we got introduced to Fairy Law, and then later on with Fairy Glitter and Fairy Sphere, all of these are just great additions to the story and add a lot more weight and history to the guild itself. And I cannot imagine this series without them at this point. And I honestly would love to see them used a lot more right now in 100 Years Quest. But what do you guys think? Did I do a good job explaining these? Are there any other types of spells or types of magic and places and characters in Fairy Tail, or even groups, that you'd like me to talk about or explain? Leave your thoughts and opinions in the comment section down below, as well as your suggestions. And if you haven't already, like and subscribe, hit the notification bell for updates on future videos. It really helps, and it shows you guys enjoy the content I make here on the channel and shows that you want me to do more. 10K subscribers is well within grasp, and I already taste it, so let's get there by the end of February. And once again, if you want me to do a video on Fairy Heart by itself, get this video up to 5K views by the next Fairy Tail Fridays video. And with all that said and done, I hope you all have an awesome day.